The city of Seattle shimmered under the glow of Christmas lights, each flickering bulb reflecting off the icy streets. Holiday music played faintly from the speakers of nearby shops, and the bustle of shoppers filled the air with a hum of cheer. Among the crowd, Sarah Evans, a renowned actress celebrated for her philanthropy, stepped out of a black car, her heels clicking on the pavement. She had just wrapped up a glamorous charity gala downtown, an event filled with champagne toasts, well-dressed donors, and speeches about making the world a better place. Despite the evening's success, Sarah felt drained. The air of opulence often left her yearning for something real, something unpolished and true. She adjusted her coat, pulling it tighter against the cold, and began walking toward a small café she had noticed earlier. She preferred the warmth of a cozy shop over the impersonal grandeur of high-end restaurants. As she pushed open the café door, the scent of freshly brewed coffee enveloped her, a comforting contrast to the biting winter chill outside. The café was quaint and quiet, with only a handful of patrons scattered among the tables. Sarah slipped off her gloves and approached the counter, ready to order a simple cappuccino to soothe her frayed nerves. It was then that she noticed him. A boy, no older than 8, stood near the pastry counter. His coat was too thin for the freezing weather, the hem frayed, and his shoes barely fit his small feet. His face was pale, framed by messy brown hair, and his eyes, big, round, and filled with worry, darted nervously around the room. Sarah watched as the boy reached into his pocket and pulled out a crumpled dollar bill. He held it tightly, as if it were his most prized possession, and pointed to a sandwich on display behind the glass. The cashier, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes, leaned forward and spoke softly to him. "I'm sorry, sweetheart," the cashier said, her voice laced with regret. "That's not enough. The sandwich costs $4. The boy's shoulders slumped. His small frame seemed to shrink further under the weight of the cashier's words. He nodded silently, clutching the dollar bill as he turned and began walking toward the door. Sarah's heart ached at the sight. The boy's resignation, his quiet acceptance of his plight, struck her deeply. It wasn't the first time she had encountered poverty. Her charity work often brought her face to face with harsh realities. But there was something profoundly personal about this moment. "Wait," she called out, her voice firm yet gentle. The boy froze mid-step, his head turning slightly as he looked over his shoulder. His eyes met Sarah's, and she saw a flicker of caution mixed with curiosity. She approached him slowly, not wanting to startle him, and knelt to his level. "Hi there," she said, her voice soft and reassuring. "I couldn't help but notice you. Are you hungry?" The boy nodded, his gaze dropping to the floor. "If you're enjoying this video, kindly like the video and comment your thoughts about it." Sarah smiled warmly. "Why don't you pick out what you want? I'll take care of it." His eyes widened slightly in surprise. "Really?" he whispered. "Of course," she replied. He hesitated for a moment before nodding shyly and pointing to the sandwich again. Sarah stood and approached the counter, pulling out her wallet. "I'll cover his sandwich, and let's add a hot chocolate, too." The cashier smiled appreciatively and began preparing the boy's order. Sarah turned back to him, noticing how he rubbed his hands together to warm them. "What's your name?" she asked gently. "Eli," he said, barely audible. "Well, Eli," Sarah said, handing him the warm cup of cocoa, "I think it's too cold for you to be out here alone. Where's your family?" Eli hesitated, his small hands clutching the cup tightly. "My mom's at work," he mumbled. "She works late." Sarah frowned, concern flickering across her face. "Does she know you're here?" Eli shook his head, avoiding her gaze. Sarah sighed softly. The boy's vulnerability tugged at her heart. "How about this?" she offered. "I can drive you home. It's not safe to be out here by yourself, especially at this hour." For a moment, Eli seemed unsure, his eyes darting toward the door. But something in Sarah's kind expression reassured him, and he gave a small nod. "Okay," he said quietly. As they left the cafe together, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that this encounter was no accident. Something about Eli's quiet strength and fragile demeanor made her certain there was more to his story, a story she was determined to uncover. The cold air hit them as soon as they stepped out of the cafe. Eli clutched his sandwich and hot chocolate, his small frame visibly trembling in the biting wind. Sarah adjusted her scarf and led him toward her car, her thoughts racing. She didn't want to overwhelm the boy with too many questions just yet, but her concern grew with each step. Reaching her sleek black SUV, she unlocked the doors and opened the passenger side for Eli. "Hop in. It's warm inside," she said, her tone gentle but encouraging. Eli hesitated for a moment, glancing around the quiet street before climbing in. Sarah closed the door softly behind him and walked around to the driver's side. As she started the engine, the car filled with a soothing warmth. Eli let out a small sigh, the kind of relief that only comes from escaping the cold. "Seatbelt," Sarah reminded him with a smile. He nodded and buckled himself in, still clutching his food like a lifeline. As Sarah pulled away from the curb, she glanced at him briefly. "So, Eli, where do you live?" He shifted uncomfortably, his gaze fixed on the sandwich in his hands. "Just down the street. Not far." Sarah could sense his reluctance to share too much. "All right," she said calmly. "You can just tell me where to turn." They drove in silence for a few minutes, the only sounds coming from the soft hum of the heater and the occasional slurp as Eli sipped his hot chocolate. Sarah stole a glance at him now and then, noting the way he stared out the window, his eyes distant. As they approached a dimly lit intersection, Eli pointed to the right. "Turn here," he said quietly. Sarah followed his direction, and soon they entered a neighborhood that was a stark contrast to the festive streets downtown. The houses were small and closely packed, many with peeling paint and broken fences. Some windows were boarded up, and others were dark, their curtains drawn tightly. The streetlights flickered, casting eerie shadows on the cracked sidewalks. Eli finally gestured toward a small, run-down apartment complex at the end of the street. "That's it," he murmured. Sarah pulled into the lot and parked, her heart sinking as she took in the building's condition. The brick facade was crumbling in places, and the steps leading to the entrance were uneven and covered in snow. She turned off the engine but didn't move to get out. "Eli," she began, her voice soft, "does your mom work here in the building?" He shook his head. "No, she works at the diner on 5th Street. She won't be home for a while." Sarah frowned. "So, you're here by yourself?" He nodded, his eyes downcast. Her concern deepened. "Do you have a key to get inside?" Eli reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, tarnished key. He held it up briefly before slipping it back into his coat. "Okay," Sarah said, thinking carefully. "How about I walk you to your door, just to make sure you get in safely?" Eli hesitated, but eventually nodded. "Okay." They stepped out of the car, and Sarah grabbed a spare blanket from the back seat. She draped it over Eli's shoulders as they trudged through the snow toward the building's entrance. The inside of the apartment complex was even colder than the outside, the dim hallway lit by a single flickering bulb. The faint smell of mildew lingered in the air. Eli led Sarah to a door on the second floor, his footsteps echoing in the empty corridor. "This is it," he said, stopping in front of a chipped wooden door. He pulled out his key and unlocked it, pushing the door open slowly. Sarah peeked inside, her breath catching at the sight. The apartment was sparsely furnished, with a worn-out couch in the living room and a small kitchen off to the side. The air was cold, the heat either turned off or too weak to make a difference. A few toys were scattered on the floor, their bright colors a stark contrast to the drab surroundings. "Eli," she said gently, stepping inside, "how long has your mom been at work?" "Since this morning," he replied, placing his sandwich carefully on the counter. "She works double shifts a lot." Sarah's chest tightened. She walked over to the thermostat and checked it. It was barely functioning. She turned it up as much as it would go, hoping to bring some warmth into the space. "Do you have enough to eat here?" she asked, glancing at the nearly empty kitchen shelves. Eli shrugged. "Sometimes." Sarah took a deep breath, her resolve hardening. "Eli, I want to help. Do you think your mom would mind if I stayed for a little while? Just until she gets home." He looked at her, his eyes wide and uncertain, but then he nodded slowly. "I think that would be okay." As Sarah sat down on the worn couch, she knew this was only the beginning. There was a story here, a story of struggle and survival, and she was determined to uncover it. Part 3. Uncovering the Truth. Sarah sat on the worn couch, her heart heavy as she surveyed the apartment. The sparse furnishings and the faint chill in the air spoke of hard times. Eli sat on the other side of the couch, nibbling on his sandwich in silence. She could see the faint shadows under his eyes and the way his small hands trembled slightly, not just from the cold, but from an exhaustion far beyond his years. She wanted to ask more questions, but she didn't want to overwhelm him. So, instead, she decided to take a gentle approach. "That's a nice sandwich you picked," she said, offering a warm smile. "Is it your favorite?" Eli nodded, his gaze still focused on the floor. "I like ham and cheese. Mom says it's simple, so it's good for me." Sarah chuckled softly. "It's a classic. Your mom sounds like she's very thoughtful." At the mention of his mother, Eli's face softened. "She tries," he said, his voice quiet. "She works a lot because we need money. She says it's hard, but we'll be okay." The strength in his words surprised Sarah. Despite his age, Eli seemed to carry a weight that no child should bear. She leaned forward slightly, her voice gentle. "Does she work late every night?" "Most nights," he replied. "She's a waitress, and her boss always makes her stay until closing." Sarah felt a pang of anger at the situation. No child should be left alone so often. But she also understood that Eli's mother was likely doing her best in an impossible situation. "Do you have anyone else around?" she asked cautiously. "Any neighbors or family who help out?" Eli shook his head. "No family. It's just me and Mom." He hesitated, then added, "Sometimes Mrs. Grayson next door checks on me, but she's really old and doesn't leave her apartment much." Sarah nodded thoughtfully. The picture was becoming clearer, and it troubled her deeply. She decided it was time to offer some practical help. "Eli," she said, "I noticed it's a bit cold in here. Do you know if your mom has been able to pay the heating bill?" His small shoulders lifted in a shrug. "She tries. But sometimes she says we have to wait until her paycheck comes." Sarah's heart clenched. She reached into her bag and pulled out her phone. "How about I call someone who can help with that? There are programs for families like yours that make sure you have heat in the winter." Eli looked up at her, his eyes cautious but curious. "Really? Really?" she said, smiling. "And while we're at it, we can make sure there's more food in the house. Would you like that?" He nodded slowly, a flicker of hope lighting up his face. Just then, the door creaked open. Sarah turned to see a woman step inside, her face pale with exhaustion. She wore a faded diner uniform and carried a small purse that looked as worn as the rest of the apartment. "Eli," the woman called softly, her voice weary. "Mom." Eli jumped up and ran to her, throwing his arms around her waist. The woman hugged him tightly, then looked up and noticed Sarah. Her tired eyes widened in surprise. "Who are you?" Sarah stood, offering a kind smile. "Hi, I'm Sarah Evans. I met Eli at the cafe down the street. He was there alone, and I just wanted to make sure he got home safely." Eli's mother hesitated, her expression shifting between gratitude and embarrassment. "Thank you," she said softly, her voice strained. "I didn't know he'd gone out." Sarah stepped closer, her tone empathetic. "I understand you're doing your best, but it seems like things are really hard right now. I'd like to help if you'll let me." The woman's lips trembled, and for a moment, it seemed like she might refuse. But then her shoulders sagged, and she nodded. "I don't know how we got here," she admitted, tears brimming in her eyes. "I'm trying so hard, but it feels like it's never enough." Sarah placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "You don't have to do this alone," she said firmly. "Let's figure this out together." Eli's mother looked at her, a glimmer of hope breaking through her exhaustion. "Thank you," she whispered. As Sarah sat down with the mother and son to discuss a plan, she couldn't help but feel a sense of purpose. This wasn't just a chance encounter. It was an opportunity to make a real difference. Sarah sat at the small kitchen table with Eli and his mother, Grace. The dim light from the overhead bulb cast long shadows across the room, emphasizing the wear and tear of the apartment. Grace, still in her diner uniform, leaned back in her chair, her exhaustion evident. Eli sat quietly next to her, nibbling on the remains of his sandwich while keeping a close eye on Sarah, as though trying to gauge her intentions. "So," Sarah began gently, "I want to help, but I need to understand more about your situation. Grace, can you tell me a bit about what's been going on? Grace hesitated, her hands fiddling nervously with the strap of her purse. It's just, life's been hard since Eli's dad left, she admitted, her voice shaky. We were barely scraping by when he was around, but when he walked out, it got worse. I had to take on double shifts at the diner just to keep a roof over our heads. Sarah nodded, her expression sympathetic but determined. That's a heavy load to carry on your own. Have you been able to apply for any assistance? Programs to help with food, heating, or childcare? Grace shook her head, a tinge of embarrassment coloring her cheeks. I don't have the time to go through all that paperwork, and honestly, I didn't know where to start. I've just been trying to survive day by day. Sarah's heart ached for her. She could see the immense pressure Grace was under, the way her every action seemed driven by the need to provide for Eli, no matter how much it cost her. Okay, Sarah said, her tone practical. Here's what we're going to do. First, I'll help you get in touch with some organizations that specialize in supporting single parents. They can provide financial assistance, help with bills, and even connect you with better job opportunities. Grace's eyes widened. Really? Do you think they'll help us? I know they will, Sarah said confidently, and I have contacts who can speed up the process. But I'll need your permission to get things started. Grace nodded quickly, her desperation outweighing her pride. Yes, please. I'll take any help you can give. Sarah smiled, feeling a sense of relief. Good. We'll also make sure Eli has everything he needs. Clothes, school supplies, and food. No more empty shelves in this kitchen. Grace looked down, tears slipping silently down her cheeks. Thank you, she whispered. You have no idea how much this means to us. Eli, who had been listening quietly, looked up at Sarah with a shy smile. You're really nice, he said softly. Sarah reached over and tousled his hair. And you're really brave, she replied. But you don't have to be so brave all the time, okay? It's okay to let people help. For the first time that evening, Grace's face softened into a smile. He's been my rock through all of this, she said, looking at Eli with pride. I don't know what I'd do without him. Sarah nodded, understanding the bond between them. Well, now he doesn't have to carry the weight alone. And neither do you. As the conversation continued, Sarah pulled out her phone and began making calls. She reached out to a local food bank, arranging for an emergency delivery to Grace's apartment. She also contacted a friend who worked at a nonprofit organization focused on helping single mothers. By the end of the night, she had secured an appointment for Grace to meet with a caseworker the following day. Everything's set, Sarah said as she ended the last call. Tomorrow, you'll start getting the support you need. Grace stared at her, a mix of disbelief and gratitude in her eyes. I don't even know how to thank you, she said. You've done more for us in one night than anyone else has in years. You don't have to thank me, Sarah replied. Just promise me you'll accept the help and keep moving forward. You and Eli deserve so much more than this. Grace nodded, her tears falling freely now. Eli, sensing the shift in his mother's emotions, climbed into her lap and wrapped his arms around her neck. As Sarah watched them, she felt a deep sense of fulfillment. Helping this small family was a stark reminder of why she had started her philanthropy work in the first place. It wasn't about the galas or the speeches. It was about moments like this. She stayed a while longer, making sure Grace understood the next steps and reassuring Eli that everything would be okay. When she finally stood to leave, Grace walked her to the door. I'll never forget what you've done for us, Grace said, her voice steady but emotional. Sarah smiled and placed a hand on her shoulder. It's just the beginning, she said. We'll get through this together. As Sarah stepped out into the cold night, she glanced back at the apartment, a sense of hope warming her heart despite the chill. She knew there was still work to be done, but for the first time, she felt certain that Grace and Eli's lives were about to change for the better. The next morning, Sarah woke early, her mind already racing with thoughts of Grace and Eli. She had stayed up late making more calls, determined to ensure everything was in place for them. As she sipped her coffee, she reviewed her notes, a meeting with a social worker, an emergency food delivery scheduled for the afternoon, and a heating technician who had agreed to inspect Grace's apartment. By mid-morning, Sarah was back at Grace's apartment, knocking on the same worn door. It creaked open to reveal Grace, her face brighter than the night before. She still looked tired, but there was a hint of hope in her eyes now. "Sarah," Grace said, her voice filled with warmth. "Come in." Eli's finishing his breakfast. As Sarah stepped inside, the smell of toast and scrambled eggs greeted her. Eli sat at the small kitchen table, swinging his legs as he ate. He grinned when he saw Sarah. "Hi," he said, his voice more lively than the night before. "Hi, Eli," Sarah replied, smiling. "How are you this morning?" "Good," he said through a mouthful of toast. "Mom made me breakfast." Grace blushed slightly. "It's not much, but it's what we had." "It's perfect," Sarah said sincerely. "And by the end of the day, you'll have more than enough to make all the breakfasts you want." Grace smiled gratefully, and Sarah felt a surge of determination. "Okay," she said, pulling out her phone. "First things first. The social worker will meet us at the community center in an hour. She'll help you apply for assistance programs and figure out a plan for the long term." Grace nodded, her expression a mix of excitement and nervousness. "What about Eli? Should I bring him with me?" Sarah shook her head. "No need. I've arranged for a volunteer from the center to watch him while we're in the meeting. He'll be safe and well cared for." Eli's face fell slightly at the thought of being left behind, but Sarah knelt to his level and smiled. "Don't worry, Eli. You're going to have so much fun. They have toys and games, and you'll even get to meet other kids. How does that sound?" Eli hesitated, but eventually nodded. "Okay," he said quietly. An hour later, they arrived at the community center. The building was bustling with activity, filled with people from all walks of life. Sarah led Grace and Eli inside, where they were greeted by a friendly volunteer who escorted Eli to a brightly colored playroom. Grace watched him go, her hands wringing nervously. "I've never done anything like this before," she admitted. "You're doing great," Sarah reassured her. "This is the first step toward a better future." The meeting with the social worker, a kind woman named Lisa, lasted over an hour. Lisa asked Grace detailed questions about her situation and worked quickly to fill out applications for food assistance, housing aid, and childcare support. She even provided information about job training programs that could help Grace find higher-paying work. By the end of the meeting, Grace looked overwhelmed but relieved. "I didn't know there was so much help out there," she said, her voice trembling. "There's a lot available," Lisa said warmly. "And with Sarah's support, you'll have access to everything you need to get back on your feet." As they left the meeting room, Sarah could see the weight lifting from Grace's shoulders. She led her back to the playroom, where Eli was happily stacking blocks with another child. "Mom!" he called out, running to her with a wide grin. Grace knelt and scooped him into a hug. "Hey, sweetheart, did you have fun?" "Yeah. Look what I made," he said, holding up a small wooden car. Grace smiled, tears glistening in her eyes. "That's wonderful, Eli." Sarah watched the exchange, her heart full. This was what it was all about, creating moments of joy and connection that could pave the way for a brighter future. But as they returned to the apartment, a new challenge awaited them. The heating technician was already there, inspecting the old radiator in the corner of the living room. He stood as they entered, his expression serious. "Bad news," he said. "The heating system is completely shot. It's not safe to use." Grace's face fell. "But what do we do? We can't afford a new system." Sarah stepped forward, her resolve unshaken. "Don't worry," she said firmly. "I'll cover the cost. We'll get a new system installed as soon as possible." The technician nodded. "I can get started tomorrow. In the meantime, I'll leave you a couple of space heaters to keep the apartment warm." Grace looked at Sarah, her eyes filling with tears again. "You've done so much already. I don't know how I'll ever repay you." "You don't need to repay me," Sarah said softly. "This isn't charity. It's about helping a friend. And that's what you are now, Grace. A friend." Grace hugged her tightly, her gratitude pouring out in waves. As Sarah left the apartment that evening, she felt a deep sense of fulfillment. There were still hurdles to overcome, but she knew Grace and Eli were on the right path, and she was committed to walking that path with them every step of the way. Over the next few weeks, Sarah's involvement in Grace and Eli's lives grew deeper. What had started as a chance encounter turned into a profound bond. Sarah juggled her work commitments with her dedication to ensuring the small family was given every opportunity to thrive. The new heating system was installed within days, filling the apartment with warmth for the first time in months. Grace called Sarah the evening it was completed, her voice trembling with emotion. "I can't thank you enough," she said. "Eli and I slept so well last night. It was the first time we didn't need to pile on blankets to stay warm." "You're welcome, Grace," Sarah replied. "This is just the beginning. There's so much more we're going to accomplish." One of those accomplishments came through the job training program Sarah had helped Grace enroll in. The program not only provided practical skills, but also helped Grace land a part-time administrative position with the promise of full-time work once she completed her certification. The pay was better, and the hours allowed her to spend more time with Eli. "Mom's always home for dinner now," Eli proudly told Sarah during one of her visits. The transformation in their lives was evident. The once empty shelves in their kitchen were now stocked with groceries, and the apartment, though still modest, felt like a true home. Eli even had a new winter coat, boots, and a backpack for school, all gifts from Sarah, who insisted he have everything he needed. One evening, Sarah invited Grace and Eli to her house for dinner. Grace had been hesitant at first, feeling out of place in Sarah's world, but Sarah reassured her. "You're my friends," Sarah said warmly, "and friends share meals together." The evening was a revelation for both Grace and Eli. They marveled at Sarah's home, not for its size or luxury, but for the warmth and care she put into welcoming them. Eli especially loved the roaring fireplace and spent most of the evening curled up next to it, playing with a toy train Sarah had bought him. As they sat around the table, Sarah listened to Grace talk about her new job, her eyes shining with pride. "It feels good to work somewhere where people treat you with respect," Grace said. "And to know I'm building something for Eli's future." "You're doing amazing, Grace," Sarah said sincerely. "You've worked so hard to get to this point, and I'm so proud of you." Grace smiled, her cheeks flushing slightly. "I couldn't have done it without you. You gave us hope when we had none." "It was already inside you," Sarah replied. "You just needed a little support to bring it out." As the weeks turned into months, Grace's confidence grew. She began volunteering at the community center that had helped her, offering support to other single parents who were facing similar struggles. "Sarah inspired me," she told the center's director one day. "She showed me what kindness can do. I want to pass that on." Eli thrived as well, his grades improving at school and his cheerful energy lighting up every room he entered. He often told Sarah about his dreams of becoming a pilot, and she encouraged him every step of the way. "You can do anything you set your mind to," she told him one afternoon. "Never stop dreaming, Eli." One evening, months after their first meeting, Grace and Eli invited Sarah to dinner at their now cozy apartment. The once drab space was filled with warmth and life, adorned with small decorations Eli had made at school. As they sat around the table, Grace raised her glass of sparkling cider. "To Sarah," she said, her voice thick with emotion, "for believing in us when we didn't believe in ourselves. You changed our lives." Sarah felt her throat tighten, but she smiled through her tears. "To Grace and Eli," she replied, "for showing me the power of resilience and love. You're the real heroes of this story." They clinked their glasses, and laughter filled the room. As Sarah drove home that night, she reflected on how much her life had changed since that cold winter evening when she met Eli in the cafe. What had started as a small act of kindness had blossomed into something far greater, a journey of transformation, hope, and friendship. She realized that the most meaningful moments in life often come from unexpected places. Helping Grace and Eli hadn't just changed their lives. It had changed hers as well, filling her days with purpose and her heart with joy. Sarah knew she would always be there for them, not out of obligation, but because they had become part of her family. And together, they had proven that even in the darkest times, a spark of kindness could light the way to a brighter tomorrow.